And I've seen like some pretty incredible stuff. I've had a basketball player back at UC Davis when I was there, dealt with patellar tendinopathy since his freshman year of high school. And it was after practice, like, oh, Hunter, my knee like is killing me. And I've tried ISOs, I've tried all this different stuff with him to try to like alleviate some of the pain, and it put a band-aid on it. I was like, wait, let me try one more thing. So I came down, grabbed a neurospike ball. He rolled his foot out for a minute, and he put his shoe back on and was like, I don't feel an ounce of pain right now.
Welcome to the Athletic Edge podcast. I'm your host, Liam Evans, strength and conditioning coach and owner of Evans Performance. This is a podcast tailored for athletes, coaches, and parents interested in every facet of athletic development. Join me and guests from around the world as we dive into game-changing tools and expert insights covering strength training, performance enhancement, and long-term athletic development strategies. Uncover the keys to elevate your athletic potential, drawing from trusted resources to safely and effectively navigate your training and build your athletic edge. Welcome back to the episode. Today I'm joined by Hunter Eisenhower, who is the Associate Head Coach of Sports Performance at Arizona State University, and he also is the co-owner of Move the Needle Human Performance, where he also has his own podcast and provides online training and education. Welcome to the show, Hunter.
Thanks for having me, Liam. I appreciate it.
For sure. Before we get too deep into anything, do you want to just give people a quick background on you, who you are, where you've been, and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so I'll go through it quick. I played basketball my entire life. I played college basketball at Seattle Pacific University. I was there, did my first couple internships in the Seattle area. I tried to just like squeeze everything I could out of that area and get as much experience as possible. So I interned at Seattle Pacific, where I went to school. I interned at Seattle University in Washington with football. And that was kind of what the first two were great. Don't get me wrong. Like I really enjoyed my internships, but Washington football was really what exposed me to high level strength and conditioning, and the staff was amazing there. I still keep in contact with almost everybody on that staff. And from there, I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. I got my master's at Minnesota State Mankato, and I worked with a bunch of sports there. And it was great that I went to a small school for my GA, because I see here and I see at other big schools that a GA typically doesn't have their own teams. They kind of help out. They're pretty much a glorified intern, but there I was fully responsible for men's basketball, women's basketball, volleyball, cross country, and golf. And then I also was an assistant for football, and it was able to write the redshirt football program. So that was just like a great experience to start my career. I got so many hours in those first 2 years. And then I went to Southeastern Louisiana. I was there for 6 months, very short period over COVID. Me and my wife turned 26, so we're no longer on our parents' insurance anymore. So we're like, hey, we can't have a part-time job. Lucky enough, connection at the University of Washington landed me at UC Davis, where I worked under Jeff Burke for about 2 years, which was incredible. Again, a lot of coaching experience, working men's basketball, football, water polo, baseball, just a bunch of teams, which was great. My daughter was born in October. I transitioned to the Sacramento Kings. I worked there for a year. And then after the season ended last year, when we lost to the Warriors in the playoffs, interviewed for a couple jobs, ended up at Arizona State, which has been incredible. And it's been a schedule that's a lot more manageable with a 1-year-old than the NBA and G League life.
Yeah, I'm sure you need to get to that point where you have a little bit of work-life balance, especially when the family comes
sure.
first now, and a little less. I mean, it sounds like you've done quite a bit of traveling around, so it must be nice to settle down and hopefully stay here for a little
Yeah,
while.
the college season seems so short compared to the G League and NBA season
True, yeah.
last year, because we wrapped up a couple weeks ago, and the G League season was still rolling, and obviously the NBA season's far from over. So I was like, dang, if I was still in the middle of it, I would be still traveling multiple times a week for prolonged periods. And right now we're in off-season mode where I get to go home every night and have most of my weekends. So it's great.
How did that? Were you with the G League team and the NBA team at the same time?
The way that it's structured, at least in Sacramento, is that everything operates out of Sacramento.
Okay.
So the G League team is the Stockton Kings, but we practiced in Sacramento. So the whole summer league, training camp, all of that, I was with the Sacramento Kings, and then I was with Sacramento for like the first couple games of the season. And then the G League season started, and I went over to Stockton to be the head strength coach for the Stockton Kings. And I would periodically have opportunities to go assist with the the NBA team, but I was like so busy with the G League team that there wasn't, like, we overlapped in Salt Lake City one night, so I was able to go to the game and be there. And then there was a couple times at home where I was able to catch practice and stuff. And then the G League season ends pretty soon, so I was with the NBA team back for the end of the regular season for, I think it was like 8 games, couple weeks, and then throughout that playoff series with the Warriors. So front end all summer NBA, bulk of the middle in season G League, and then end of the season playoffs NBA. So it was a really cool role because I got to learn, be around a ton of staff, and then I got to go to the G League, kind of run my own show, and then go back to the NBA and wrap up the NBA season. So like I have nothing but positive things to say about that experience and that staff for sure.
Yeah, how did that work as far as in season? Obviously, in the NBA, you're playing what 3, maybe 4 games a week, if that. And then so you have the preseason leading into that. Are most of those players with you guys for their offseason and preseason, and then you get into the
So everybody's back in the building by training camp, but the way it kind of worked throughout the summer. So like I got hired right before summer league, so I went to summer league, and then I got back. And when I got back, it was one guy in the facility
Mhm.
training because everybody kind of goes their separate ways. Nobody's really around, like staff and players, because that's kind of like a dead period where you get a little vacation. And then it felt like every single week leading up to training camp, like one or two more guys came back into the
Yeah.
facility. So by the time we got 2 weeks out from training camp, we had a majority of everybody. And then by the time you get to the week before training camp, you at least see everybody once, and then training camp starts, and everybody's obviously there rolling. So it kind of just like slowly progresses to the point where you get everybody in the facility by training camp.
Okay, yeah, and then once you get into the in season, is it just lifting as frequently as you can to try and maintain whatever you've built, or how did that work? Because I know a lot of coaches have a little bit different approach and maybe do at post game lifts and then have a complete off day or anything like that.
So the way I operated within the G League was a little bit different than the way we operate in the NBA in terms of in Sacramento because so like in Sacramento, there's like accommodations made to be able to lift post game and
Yeah,
get guys in like pre games after their shooting time. But when you're on the road in the G League, you don't get the same accommodations in terms of equipment setup like post
yeah,
game or anything.
yeah,
So
yeah. I
like there
gotcha.
would be maybe one arena. Like I can't even remember off the top of my head a single arena where there was equipment set up that you could actually train guys after. So at home, I kind of like makeshifted a little weight room in our arena with some dumbbells that was left over and just like kind of turned this random empty room into a weight room. So I would train my guys on practice days. And then if we went on long trips, I would throw some in at the hotel. And then if we went a period of time with a lot of home games and I wasn't able to have a lot of practice time to train, then we would train post game in that weight room, and it would just be super simple stuff because we just had dumbbells and
Yeah,
mats and stuff. But in the NBA, it was typically some pregame stuff, some postgame stuff, and then practice days. You really didn't do much, especially on the road. Like you just waited till game time because those opposing arenas have weight rooms set up for you, or not weight rooms, but at least stuff to train guys.
something. Yeah. And is that so? Getting on to kind of what we want to focus on today, and your force system, is that where it was kind of starting to be born? How you looked at the force system and all that, or was that more, or even before you got to the NBA and the G League?
No, it was last year. Like it was like we talked about earlier. I don't know if it was before we started recording, but like the schedule within that space is just grueling.
Yeah.
And people that I worked for, like the head strength coach and the director of performance, I like my daughter was born in October and we started training camp the end of October. And being a new dad, it hit me kind of hard being like, okay, now I'm gone for 14 days when my daughter's 3 weeks old. And I struggled with it. And what they told me was because they both have kids, the two people that I'm referring to, Zach Howe and Jazz Randall at the Kings, they both told me like, hey, it's tough. Like it's not easy being away from your family, but you're gonna feel a lot worse about a trip if you spend all your time that you're not like training guys or at a game, like scrolling on Instagram and watching Netflix.
Yeah.
But if you fill your time with reading, uh, taking a course, talking to different individuals around the country, you're going to feel a lot better about your time. And that I'm glad they told me that early on because I think I would have utilized the time in the same way I did. But it was always in the back of my head, like I'm doing my family a disservice if I'm not getting better when I'm on these road trips because I'm not with them. So I might as well like try to put myself in a better position professionally. Um, so all that to be said, like I just had a lot of opportunity to read, to think, to talk to individuals, and I read Force by Dan Cleather early on in my time, and when I got there, it was my first time having force plates of my own to use however I wanted.
Yeah.
And then reading that book and starting to do some self experiments, I was just seeing some different things with peak force. with different movements I did. And that it really started with like the high force component. And I know we'll get into like each piece of it, but it really started with the high force component. And it really didn't my intention was not to create this like system. It was just to focus on that one piece. But then I realized that there was other aspects of performance that I felt like tied into things that for me it was really just an opportunity to organize my thoughts of how I want to program. And then I just like started posting about it more, and there like was a little bit more interest about it, so I just kind of posted about it a little bit more and more, and wrote a program, wrote a couple articles, and it's kind of like snowballed into what it is today. But initially it was just like self experimentation and finding a couple things out that I thought were interesting.
Yeah, exactly. That's awesome. And so, again, before we even get into the pillars of it, for those listening that may not even be like, let's try and make it as simple as possible, may not even be strength coaches, maybe athletes. What is force, and why is it important or relevant to training and to sports?
I would say that there's different types of force, but what I think of is like ground reaction force. And when you talk about the game of basketball, there's going to be other forces that are present that aren't necessarily ground reaction forces. Like you're going to be interacting with other humans and whatever in a rebounding situation or in a pick and roll situation where the force that is occurring is between two individuals. But when I think of like the highest forces that occur in basketball per se, I kind of relate it to like triple jumpers because I've always been kind of amazed by what they do. And I've always thought like, wow, the amount of force that they probably create on their jumps is
Insane.
insane. The amount of
Yeah.
ground reaction force. And there's actually a study done at the University of Iowa a long time ago that found that triple jumpers in the study that they conducted created up to 22 times body weight forces within, I forgot what exact step of the jump it was, but within their jump.
Yeah.
And then if you watch the game of basketball, and I think of somebody like, I don't know, think of like Anthony Edwards like coming down on a fast break and he like hits a euro step around a guy. Again, it's probably not the same amount of force that a triple jumper creates because they're in a very constrained environment, just running straight, no variables to consider other than the jump. But I would say that if you were able to slide a force plate under their foot or Anthony Edwards' foot during that time, that ground reaction force would be insane. And all this to say, like throughout those self experiments, I realized that some of the traditional methods that we use to train quote unquote strength probably don't touch those peak ground reaction forces. Now, if you're doing plyos and sprinting, you're getting there, but I think there's also ways to get to 9, 10, 11, 12 times body weight forces in order to raise the ceiling of the force that the body is able to produce and also like expose them to that periodically as kind of like a way to touch training residuals. So, I mean, force is the name of the game. If you can produce more force at the right angle, at the right speed, like you're probably going to be a little bit better off. So, it's trying to marry up the magnitude of force in training and the magnitude of force that the athletes, I'm assuming, uh, feel in sport.
Yeah, exactly. And for those listening, just for context, I took a bit from your article with Simply Faster, and it was one of your self-run experiments where I think you said you had a body weight of 250 pounds and you lifted a 385-pound trap bar with max intent, and that produced 2,968 newtons of force. And then just to put that into perspective, that's like 3.1 times your body weight. And what he just mentioned with the triple jumper was what, 20, 21, 22?
22.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yes, there's force produced obviously in the trap bar, but essentially that's nothing in comparison to what a triple jumper or even a basketball player might feel when he's doing some of those movements. And I think you did a 42-inch depth drop, which for those that may not know is just 42 inches on a box, step off, fall essentially, and then you're just landing on a force plate in this case, and that produced 4,000 over 4,000 newtons of force, which is roughly 4.3 times your body weight. So do you have anything to say on those?
Well, I was just going to say that there's also like intramuscular forces, which I haven't really dove into as much. I've been more on like the ground reaction force side of things, but I've been thinking about the muscular forces and what that would entail and how that would fit into the system. But this is going to be something that continues to evolve weekly. So there's layers that I think of and try to add weekly to it. And I think that like the one thing that this might be going on a tangent, but I feel like some people hit me with this early on. It's like, okay, well, if they experience these forces in sport, then why do you need to train it? Like, wouldn't
Training.
the sport then be the training that you
Hmm.
need to experience the high forces? And the conclusion that I've come to is kind of like when you look at like max velocity sprinting. Athletes don't hit max velocity sprinting like, let's say football. They might hit it occasionally, but they don't hit it all the time. So you need to give them doses of it. And that's kind of like my thought with this high force stuff. Like, yeah, they probably Anthony Edwards probably creates really high peak forces when he plays. But how often is he doing that? How often is he getting the opportunity to fast break, slam on the brakes, huge max decel, really high peak forces? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I watch a lot of basketball and you don't see those type of movements every single game. So in season, I want to expose athletes to it as like a in order to maintain that residual because I don't want them to go a month, 6 weeks without experiencing that peak force. And then it's like, boom, we need to do it in the game, and their tissues and their system is not prepared for it. And then the same token in the off season, yes, they're playing basketball. Yes, they're still competing, but I want to try to raise the ceiling of the ability to produce force.
Yeah.
Because if their limit is 8 times body weight and I can get them to 10 times body weight, then I think that the capacity that then we've developed in the offseason is going to lend itself to being better on the court and being able to do different things in different ways.
Yeah. And I want to ask a question there, but I think we'll get to it when we talk more about how we can program this in. So I'll leave it for now, and let's get into kind of so what are the four pillars of the force system, and then from there we can go into the first one.
Yeah. So the four pillars are high force, fast force, slow force, and human force.
And so let's go into high force. What is high force, and how why is it important? Why do we need it?
Yeah. I mean, high force is kind of everything that we've talked about to this point. So I won't necessarily dig into the why because I feel like that's kind of been explained, but the actual pieces of it that I think you kind of flow throughout a athlete's career or throughout an annual plan would be there's still an element of like traditional high intensity movements and training because I'm not throwing out tradition. I'm just like progressing from it. I like to say like I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. I'm just trying to like upgrade the wheel. So I still start early off season, and then touch back into it like preseason, early in season with traditional movements, increasing intensities, linear approach to periodization, just like most people do.
Hmm.
But then it's kind of this transition into three other pillars within the high force concept that I utilize in different ways. So the three are overcoming ISOs, uh, drop catches, and depth drops. So overcoming ISOs would be imagine you like a isometric mid thigh pull.
Yeah.
There's a barbell. It is secured to a rack. You're not going to be able to lift it. The rack's bolted to the ground, and you're just pulling against that bar as hard as you can. There's variations I like more than the IMTP, but the IMTP seems to be the one that everybody refers to because it's the one that's most researched typically.
Hmm.
And then there's drop catches, which is if you think of like a trap bar deadlift, you're standing at the top of a trap bar deadlift and you're just going to drop as fast as you can and slam on the brakes right before the weight hits the ground. And then there's depth drops, which you already kind of explained. You're standing on a high surface, you drop off and you land, and the strategy is extremely important with the drop catches and the depth drops. And what I mean by that is if you do a drop catch and you allow the weight to kind of like you stop at 8 inches from the weight hitting the floor and it just kind of continues to melt toward the ground, the peak
Hmm.
force is going to be pretty slow or
Yeah.
low. In the same way with a depth drop, if you drop off a box and it's just a very compliant melting strategy in terms of landing, your peak force isn't going to be very high. But if you can slam on the brakes, stop really abruptly, your peak force will be much higher.
When you're doing that, say with an athlete, what type of landing are you actually cueing them to do?
So when I utilize drop catches, it's typically always I always say like stick it like a statue or
Yeah.
land like a statue. But I think that there is a time and place to introduce different types of landings within like a depth drop. And
Hmm.
what I found is that especially with basketball players, a lot of them only have one strategy of landing and it's stiff.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times you don't have to tell them to land stiff because that's all they know. They know stiffness. They know um, like springiness because that's what their sport requires. It requires them to be stiff, stiff ground contacts all the way up through the chain. And I think that like in early off season when I begin to introduce these, I like to introduce with more of a compliant emphasis because
Hmm.
it gives them hopefully more tools in their toolbox of how they can kind of like dissipate forces because while this whole thing has been about like high peak forces, there's also a time in the game where you need to land with potentially a little bit more compliant strategy, especially if you're coming off the rim in like an awkward angle.
Yeah.
To where if you only know stiffness, 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 and you don't know how to be more compliant, you're probably going to hurt yourself. So I think that like early in the process of introducing depth drops, you do have them like, hey, I want you to melt to the ground. I want you to land as soft and quiet as possible. And then once you transition those depth drops further into the off season and you want to create those higher forces, now it's like, hey, stick it like a statue, land as hard as you can. But I think there's a time and place for both for sure. It's a good
Yes.
question
So essentially, you can manipulate said adaptation or whatever variable you're looking within the same exercise, just like with anything else. And
for sure.
those are the three that you mentioned. Those are the three from what you found the highest force producing movements, even over
Yep.
traditional lifts that people would think.
Yeah, and then the last piece to that is kind of like the speed development component, and it's the deceleration piece because Damian Harper has done a lot of work within that deceleration piece, and somebody that I follow. I would love if Damian Harper ends up listening to this. I would love to have him on my podcast. So I've been trying to get a hold of that man for forever. So Damian Harper, if you want to come on Move the Needle, please reach out. But he has done a lot of work with like the deceleration piece, and I feel like that fits great into the high force training model because he talks about how if you compare max decelerations, max velocity, and max accelerations, max decelerations have the highest relative peak force.
Yeah.
Um, so to me, putting athletes in a position to be able to express these higher peak forces in more of like a game like situation of what they'll actually do is the last piece that I think is really important that I focus on within this day.
Can we work on the deceleration aspect other than when they're actually just in practice or in a game and it's happening naturally? Is that something that we can kind of train?
Yeah, I think so because I think that using some of those principles that we talked about before, specifically the drop catches and the depth drops, because they kind of force you to train the qualities that are important in deceleration, like eccentric rate of force development and peak
Yeah.
braking forces. Um, I think that by doing those, you're probably building the capacity and magnitude to be able to hit a harder max decel.
Hmm.
Um, and then I also think that if you put athletes into constraint games to where like decels and change of direction are the name of the game, they probably get exposed to it
A
more than
little
in
more.
like the game of basketball. And I really like to use like tag variations. And if you watch somebody play tag, it is nonstop sprint, stop, change direction, sprint, stop, sprint, stop. And I think that you are probably, again, I don't have force plates on my basketball court to know if
Yeah.
they're creating higher peak forces, but you can watch and it's a pretty good theory of mine that you give athletes more of an opportunity to train with higher peak forces, specifically in decelerations in games like tag.
Yeah.
And then the last piece that I think is really cool, and Derek Hansen has talked about like his 10 by 10 protocol with accelerations. But we recently talked to him and he was talking about how you can manipulate the deceleration portion of the 10 by 10. So you accelerate for 10 yards, and then typically you have 10 yards to decelerate. You turn around and hit another 10-yard acceleration. You do that 10 times, and that's 10 by 10. You can do two, three, whatever sets of it. But one thing that he was talking about that I really like that I think helps more of like the capacity to deal with all of the decelerations that athletes deal with in their sport is you manipulate the back end of the decel portion of that 10 by 10. So you might sprint 10 yards, but now you have 8 yards to decel.
Yeah.
So now, like, if you're able to track the speed that they're going through that acceleration with, and it's 95 plus of their whatever, like if that's going to be your barrier for entry, now they have to decel in 8 yards or 6 yards, and the demand for that deceleration goes up. And if you do two or three sets of that, now they're getting 20 to 30 pretty high level decelerations, and now you're trying to build the capacity to decelerate. So it's kind of like the depth drops and some of those tag variations, I think, build like your the magnitude of your decelerations or max decel. And then I think if you can implement some of that 10 by 10 stuff, but with manipulated deceleration pieces, I think that you then begin to build the capacity, because it's great if they can have one extremely high max decel, but as everybody knows, the game of basketball in college is 40 minutes. So fatigue sets in and they have to be able to capacity to handle those max decels in the second half. So if they don't have the capacity to do it, then by minute 38 of a game, you're screwed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And then so moving on into pillar two, what is that?
Pillar two, fast force. This is born from, again, like all of these things that I talk about are really just like concepts and pieces that I've taken from different people and learned from different ways, and then a little bit of self experiment to kind of construct this model. So somebody like Joel Smith and his Elastic Essentials course was huge for me to kind of just like reimagine how I view training athletes and introduce me to this topic of elasticity that I think is imperative and for athletic performance. And so I would say that the goal of like fast force training is to create more elastic athletes. And there's some pillars to that I really focus on, and it's really focus on the feet and getting athletes out of their shoes, and exposing them to different surfaces, and then also training like the intrinsic muscles of their feet. There's speed development, and that's more in like a linear fashion, whether it's acceleration or max velocity, and then there's components within that. And then there is a focus on faster movements in the weight room, but also a big emphasis within oscillatory movement. And then some of like the other stuff that kind of fills in the rest of the program is multi-directional training, rotational training, and then every rep different, or some people call it rep without a rep, I think. And it's this idea of you might do one exercise, but every rep within that set is going to look a little bit different. So if you're doing a single leg RDL, it's true perfect form, and then you might take the dumbbell and put it way outside your foot or way
Yeah.
inside your
Gotcha.
foot, or
Okay.
rotate when you do it. And it's just explaining these tissues to, or exposing these tissues to a lot of different variation within training. So those would be like the biggest component of fast force, with the ultimate goal of making a more elastic athlete. And really, to me, like, to explain that, because I think that word gets thrown around a lot
I was gonna
as like a
just ask.
buzzword, but yeah, to me, elasticity is just transitioning athletes wherever they're at on the spectrum of muscular driven to more elastic driven, to be more elastically driven. And again, I just use the word in the definition. So I'll go into that further. I want athletes to be able to rely more on their connective tissue, like tendons, to be able to produce their movements, than this muscular driven strategy of like eccentric to concentric, cross bridges, actin and myosin. It's just like, can I get the muscle to act better isometrically to create a base for then the tendons to stretch and recoil from? And it, in my opinion, it's more effective and efficient movement to be able to do that.
Got you. So in that, for those strategies, is that some like yielding isometrics or anything, foot and ankle complex, just holding positions or anything like that, or how are you kind of incorporating that?
Yeah, so there's not necessarily ISOs within the fast force training, but there's ISOs. I'll get into like the next pillar, which I think contribute to this, and they all kind of like work off of each other. From like the foot perspective, I think the biggest thing, especially with the population that I work with, and really like almost all sports, is getting athletes out of their shoes, not necessarily to do anything crazy, but just to expose the foot to like tactile sensation, because specifically in basketball, athletes are wearing thick soled
Thick
shoes,
shoes.
1 to 2 pairs of socks, ankles taped, and their foot has such limited access to feel the world around them. And like your vision is responsible for like 80% of the feedback that your brain gets about the world around it. But the other 20% is made up through like proprioception and tactile sensation and the vestibular system. So I think that allowing athletes to feel sensation within their feet is probably not going to take you from a 20-inch vertical to a 40-inch vertical. But I have seen some like pretty incredible things. Like I don't know if you're going to post the video or just the audio, but I have like these neurospike balls behind
Yeah,
me.
it's a video, so you could show. Yep.
And, yeah, cool. So I have these neurospike balls behind me, and I use these like throughout the entire year. And it's simply just roll your hands, roll your feet, and mostly feet, because again they're in shoes so much. And I've seen like some pretty incredible stuff. I've had a basketball player back at UC Davis when I was there. Dealt with patellar tendinopathy throughout since his freshman year of high school. And it was after practice, like, oh, Hunter, my knee like is killing me. And I've tried ISOs, I've tried all this different stuff with him to try to like alleviate some of the pain, and it put a band-aid on it. And I was like, wait, let me try one more thing. So I came down, grabbed a neurospike ball. He rolled his foot out for a minute, and he put his shoe back on and was like, I don't feel an ounce of pain right now. And now it wasn't like I fixed this chronic issue that he had for years and years and years with one, like the next
One
day he's like,
thing.
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
little sore. But if I could have a guy before he plays in a game roll his foot on this and it takes away some of the discomfort that he has in his limbs, then I think it's awesome.
So is that something you're just, in warm up, they can go barefoot, do all that sort of stuff, or when are you utilizing that?
Yeah. So in season, because of logistics, I like to use the neurospike balls because we'll be pre-practice in the locker room getting ready or pre-game, like just roll your feet on this for a little bit. But then in the off season, I kind of go away from them a little bit because I have more of an opportunity to expose them to different surfaces. So like we have a smooth surface in the weight room, but right outside the weight room we have a track, and that's more of like a raised surface. And then we have grass right next to that, and we have turf and a bubble right next to that. So like I'm able to just get them out of their shoes and expose them to the different surfaces that the neurospike ball is trying to like emulate.
Essentially get, yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of like bring it in and out, but this is mostly in season, and then different surfaces is going to be my off season go to.
Got you. And then you also mentioned the oscillatory exercise. Do you want to quickly, for people listening that may not know what that is, break that down?
Yeah. So if you were to see somebody do an oscillatory movement, and then there's kind of like three categories that I use, but in its bare bones, it's literally just like what the word is. It's an oscillation. It's like a small up and down movement within a given range of motion. And what I really like about them is that traditional training most of the time is like if you think of whatever a heavy back squat, somebody gets underneath the bar, they are tense, they are going to control the weight down. Their muscles are firing, 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 firing. They stand back up. Their muscles are firing on, like just nonstop firing of muscles. And I don't know who said it, and I've heard it time after time throughout my career, but it's this idea of like the best athletes don't necessarily turn their muscles on the quickest or most effectively, but are able to turn their muscles off.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think that like a lot of training that we do specifically in the weight room teaches us to turn our muscles on. And that's great. But I think that oscillatory movements teach your muscles to turn off and on at a very like efficient and much faster rate than traditional training does. So the three ones that I kind of do, they're really a progression within themselves that I think because the first time you do an oscillatory movement, it's going to feel a little odd. Like
Yeah.
it just feels a little bit different, especially if you've been traditionally trained with methods that are typical to weight rooms. But so the three that I use are they're called rhythm oscillatories, rapid, and relax. So rhythm is going to be a bigger range of motion, and you're kind of just like let's just think of like a rear foot elevated split squat for all of these. So like if you're in a rear foot elevated split squat, you're holding the kettlebell, and think of like a bigger range of motion, and you're just moving continuously throughout that range of motion, almost like in a bounce.
Yep.
So it's like bouncing up and down through in a bigger range of motion, and it's not control down, grind, push up. It's just kind of like a bounce. You almost feel like your musculature is not even like firing because you're just bouncing in and out of a range of motion. And then the second one is going to be rapid, and it's going to be in a much smaller range of motion. And this one, you're probably going to see like a little bit more of like a face of grinding, and you are trying to push and pull yourself in and out of a smaller range of motion. And the idea behind that is I want the agonist to be working one way, the antagonist to be relaxed, and then flip as I'm coming up and down.
Hmm.
So it's going to be flipping muscles on and off. And then the last one, again, I stole from Joel Smith's Speed Strength book, but what I consider like a relax or relaxation oscillatory is going to be you are in a like mid to upper mid position of like a rear foot elevated split squat, and you try to tense every single muscle in your entire body and squeeze as hard as you possibly can, and then all at once you try to relax your entire system and drop out of that range of motion. And in theory, the idea is that when you go from complete contraction of everything within your body to complete relaxation, you should drop a couple inches and bounce out of the bottom a little bit. And the bounce out of the bottom is going to be contributed more so by the connective tissue and tendons than like
Hmm.
the musculature itself. So you're
Gotcha.
kind of like truly training the ability to relax the system and rely on connective tissue to produce some of that like subtle movement.
What differences are you finding on a force plate between those? Are some of them you're looking just for like the rate of how quickly you can produce that force, or does it depend on the type of oscillation you're doing?
Yeah, so I would say that this is probably like my wrongdoing, but I named it the force system. But I think that force itself, in terms of like ground reaction force and force plates, has more so to do with the high force component than the others. I think that like I labeled it as high force, fast force, slow and human force because it is succinct and
Yeah, yeah,
creates consistency within the program. But within those movements, especially on like fast force and human force days, I'm not necessarily concerned with the forces that are being created. I'm more concerned with like the adaptation that's occurring. So there is a force component to those movements, but I'm less concerned about those and more concerned about like the ease of movement, the rhythm and the coordination and the reliance on other tissues other than musculature to produce movement. And again, there's a force component, but that actual force, like where I'm digging into force plate data, is more so concerned with high force days than the other ones, I would say.
if you're taking, so we're talking about rear foot elevated split squat with these. Say an athlete, if they were to do normal rear foot elevated split squat, they use 2 50-pound dumbbells. So let's say 100 pounds. For these oscillatory ones, how are you thinking about that loading strategy? Is it going to be significantly less, or are you still progressively overloading it? How is that kind of working?
No, I would say progressively less or noticeably less because the goal with those is more subjective in terms of evaluation.
Yep.
It's not necessarily like again, it's not about peak forces or weight being held. It's more about like the ease and fluidity and rhythm of the movement. So if you see an athlete holding 250-pound dumbbells and they're like grinding in and out of those movements, especially within like the rhythm oscillatory, then it's probably too heavy. Like I'll have people hold as little as a 12-kilo kettlebell and kind of just like bouncing it out of that movement because it's not necessarily as much about the weight being held and the progression of the weight, but the progression is going to be through the ease and fluidity of the movement more so than like the intensity that you're loading it.
Yep. Perfect. Makes
So
sense.
much more subjective, and I think that that probably irks some strength coaches because they want to be able to progress things with weight and intensity. But I think that you can watch somebody do one of these movements for the first time after never doing them before or have never doing them before, and being just trained with very traditional powerlifting methods. And the first time they do it, you're like, oh my gosh, you have no rhythm, bounce, fluidity to your movement at all. And then after a couple weeks of doing it, you see that ease get to them. And I think that again, that quality is subjective, but it's really important.
Yeah, and I think because you even mentioned it um, before, and it's like, yes, we have the strength in the weight room, but then also it's a little bit different than strength either out on a court or out on a field. And I think that goes more to the rhythm side of things, and essentially being an athlete, not just a weight room junkie. So to keep things moving along, go into the slow force now, which is the third pillar.
Yeah. So slow force is going to be, it's kind of like to offset the high and the fast and the sport that athletes play because high force, fast force in the sport are going to be, um, they're going to be taxing and they're going to be taxing physiologically. And one thing that I deal a lot with basketball players is like just tendon pain. And if you work with basketball players, I was a basketball player, like patellar tendinopathy is going to be a thing, whether it's the entire team or one person on your team, like you will deal with it. And when I think of like the high force day and the fast force day, it's dropping off of boxes, it's catching heavy weight, it's sprinting really fast, it's jumping, it's moving in different directions, it's moving fast. And I think that those things are great, but I really wanted to have like an aspect of this system that kind of offset that and offset the sport because there needs to be some type of like therapeutic and restorative component to training. And while holding a 3 minute split squat ISO doesn't feel very restorative and therapeutic in the moment because it sucks, I think that there's a lot of good things happening specifically in like the tendons that are going to be impactful for health and longevity. So the components of that day for me is really like global yielding isometrics. Then there's an idea of like global slower tempo movements Then there is hypertrophy, because I think that this day is more of like tissue focused. And I think that hypertrophy is going to be an element of training that should always be included, especially with young, underdeveloped basketball players. And then there's this idea of like local tissue prep, which again, I stole from my time with the Kings, which they called LXN, or loaded X needs. But I think that for me, I like the idea or the name of local tissue prep a little bit more. It's all semantics. It doesn't really
Yep.
matter,
Yep.
but in my head, I like it. So the first part, global yielding isometrics, the easiest way and the most often way I load things is with a split squat ISO, and it's going to be in like a stretch range toward the bottom, not necessarily holding weight. We load it and progress it, but like at bare bones, it's how long can you hold a split squat ISO, a bodyweight split squat ISO. I'm doing them with my guys right now in the early off season, because right now in the early off season, and I know we'll get into this of kind of constructing the year, but I think that slow force and human force are huge for the early off season. So like yesterday came in on a Monday morning and we went split squat ISO, trying to get 2.5 minutes on each leg. And we did a push-up ISO, like an elevated push-up ISO. So their chest is a little bit lower than the ground.
Yeah,
They're
I
in like
like
a
that one.
stretch
Yeah.
range, and they had to hold, yep. And they had to hold that for 1:45. So that's going to be components throughout. And then the global slow tempo movement is going to be important for like the therapeutic effects to the tendon as well, because I wouldn't say there's conflicting research, but there's two ideas within research that ISOs are really good for tendons, and then there's also an idea of like slow tempo might be better for tendons. So research is always conflicting, and like you can find one research study that disproves another one, and so on and so forth. So I utilize both because I think there's value in both. So we'll also do slow tempo, and that's like sometimes as slow as like a 40-second lower. Like we'll do very, very slow tempos. And then I'll also add a tempo to like the concentric portion of movements within this day as well. And then hypertrophy, which I mean, every strength coach's favorite topic, so I probably won't dig into that much, but hypertrophy. And then the local tissue prep piece is focusing on specific tissue that are typically under more stress or higher likelihood of injury within any given sport, um, and focusing more attention specifically on those tissues. Because if you're, for example, in a split squat ISO, you're hitting a lot of tissues. But if your front foot is flat, you're probably not really touching the Achilles or calf much in terms of actually getting like focus load through that area. So we'll hit, for me, for basketball players, it'll be gastrocsoleus Achilles, kind of like that whole complex together. It'll be hamstrings, it'll be quad patellar tendon, and it'll be adductors. And then I've started to think about like the upper body and the shoulder complex too. But it's kind of applying those yielding isometrics and those slow tempos to local tissue to try to create more of like a more robust local tissue. Because again, like some of those global movements just don't hit those
Yep.
tissues very well.
And that would be like when people are thinking of like a floating heel, split squat, and things like that.
Yeah, and it's even like more like we'll do just like a seated, uh, elevated like bend knee calf raise,
Okay. Yeah.
or we'll do a like long lever hamstring bridge, or we'll do like I use the leg extension all the time. We'll do different ISOs. We'll do different slow lowers, like all different types of movements. But I'm trying to isolate specific tissues that I know are going to be under more stress or typically injured within basketball players.
Got you. Got you. Um, and I think so. That was the yielding, hypertrophy, and local tissue prep are the were the three main components.
Yep.
Got you. And then so we can get onto everything. The last one will be human force, correct?
Correct. So that's the least objective of all categories. And there's throughout my career, like there's just been a feeling that like squat, hinge, push, pull is not all athletes need. And I
Yep.
think that there's two components to that. There's that where it's like I think that there's just more robustness that can be created by not just doing squat, hinge, push, pull, because sports are so variable. And then there's also this idea of that like there's general movement that athletes aren't exposed to for whatever reason. Like maybe they didn't. I think the world is just changing. Like early sports specialization and
Yep.
I don't know, physical education classes are changing. And it's just like, I think that there's just like innate movement patterns that help build robustness. Even if having an athlete crawl and like increasing their fluidity and rhythm and just like ability to crawl is not necessarily going to translate directly to being a better basketball player. I think that some of those like underpinning qualities that you can develop within more human type movements can contribute to more of the specific stuff. So like for me, the human force day it's endless. I'm going to list some categories, but it's really like
Yeah.
anything that fits into that general theme of innate movement patterns, I think fits. So it's like crawling, crouching, climbing, hanging, swinging, picking, just like general heavy things up. Don't think like sumo deadlift. Think of just like a heavy, like right now we have heavy med balls, 50, 80, and 100 pounds. And it's just like med ball deadlifts, just picking them up from the ground, pulling things, some type of like gymnastics. We'll do like cartwheels and handstand variations. And then I also like to use, especially with basketball players, of like partner combatives to where there's different constraints that you put on, like almost like wrestling, but
Okay.
it's not quite just as free flowing as wrestling. And there's me and a close friend of mine who I run Move the Needle with, Mike Sullivan, wrote an article on Simply Faster about partner combatives a while ago. But that's something that I utilize within this day because I feel like it fits within that realm of like human force.
And is that a whole day essentially dedicated to human force, or is this something you're using maybe as a warm up, or what does that look like?
Good question. So like this portion of the early off season, there's 2 days, 2 complete days of the week can contributing to that, dedicated to it. So we'll have 2 slow force days and 2 human force days. So we're
Okay.
not really touching any high force. We are sprinting because I think that sprinting is something that like is the one thing within my program that is within it year round.
Year round, yeah.
Um, but I would say that early off season, human force has a big component within my program. By the time we get to the in season and like later off season, it's just a warm up, just to continue to like have that general theme within the training, but not an entire day once we get to more specific periods of the year.
Got you. And that leads perfectly. Now we've got the four essentially tiers or pillars of the four systems. So now when we're thinking about
Mhm.
programming wise, could you go one, like we kind of touched on, that was more, I guess, your macro cycle programming, but so how would fit
Mhm.
in macro cycle, and then maybe even, session to session, how things look more on a micro cycle.
Like I said, early off season is going to be human and slow force emphasis for sure. And that's going to take me depending on how much time I have. So like we'll have that emphasis probably for like 2 to 4 weeks. And then as we get to like the early off season, and now it's going to be different because like a lot of guys I'm going to be training in the summer I don't have right now. So I still think that there is a need to expose those guys to some of those qualities, but I also know that my timeline to get them ready to play basketball is not endless. So I would say that logistically, I go through like this GPP, which is going to be slow force and human force. As we get to mid off season, when I get the guys during the summer, in
Hmm.
ideal world, I go into what I consider like my superpower program, where there's 2 different programs. There's going to be, well, there's really 3. There's like a young guy program, some of the freshmen, and they're going to stick to that kind of like slow human, introducing some high and fast concepts. And then there's going to be like a elastically deficient and a muscular driven or a muscular deficient program. So early summer, that elastically deficient program is going to have 2 fast force days. So really just like focusing on getting those like more muscular driven athletes to act more elastically. So they're going to have 2 fast force days, a high force day, and a slow force day with human force warm ups.
Hmm.
And then the muscular deficient program, which is going to be more of like your springy, elastically driven athletes, are probably going to have. I kind of go back and forth on whether I want 2 high force or 2 slow force days within that program, but probably 2 high force, a fast force, and a slow force. So it's not to say that they're just like focusing all on their deficiencies, but there's more of an emphasis on their deficiencies.
Yeah.
And then after a period of time of going through that, then it flips. So then you go to the superpower program where it's elastically driven or muscular driven. So now I'm going to give those athletes a little bit more of their wants or more of what they rely on. So the elastically driven program is going to have 2 fast force days, a high force day, and a slow force day. And the muscular driven program is going to have 2 high force days, a fast force day, and a slow force day. So it's really just like throughout the summer flipping. So it's like working
Hmm.
on your floor, your deficiencies, and then once we get later into the summer, now I'm flipping to work on your superpowers because that's what you're really going to rely on when you play. And
Yeah.
then in season, once we get to the in season period, my high minute guys will always have a slow force day. Like if I only get to train my high minute guys 1 day a week in season, which happens sometimes based on schedule, they'll always get a slow force day because a lot of wear and tear happens to their bodies when you're playing 30 plus minutes a night. And I think that that therapeutic restorative aspect of the slow force training is extremely impactful and the stimulus that I want to give them for sure. And then from if there's a week and most of the time I get them 2 days a week, the second day of the week is going to alternate between a high force day and a fast force day. So I'll just alternate weekly. So every 2 weeks they're touching one of those, and then the human force warm up throughout the whole part. The low minute guys are going to get the first day of the week is going to be a fast force start. So I can hit them with some extensive plyos and jumps and explosive movement because they haven't really been doing anything for the weekend and kind of trying to fill that bucket of like foot contacts that they're not getting within games. And then I'll go into the slow force piece, but instead of being more like restorative because they haven't been doing anything, it's more of like a hypertrophy emphasis. And then they'll typically train 2 other times that week, and it'll be a high force day in the middle of the week and a fast force day as we close to the game. And then something that everybody will do before the day of the game is my speed component. And I said I never take sprinting out of my program. In season, we'll have a little bit more extended warm up the day before a game, and we'll hit our speed development stuff there. So it's not as intense as the off season, but we'll have things on the practice court. We'll go through a warm up. We'll bring out the timing gates, and guys will hit some resisted sprints and sprint through the timing gates. So that's kind of like the speed development piece in season. So that, and then after that, we'll go back into the early off season. We'll go back slow force twice, human force twice, and it kind of repeats itself. So every year I want it to change a little bit, but that's kind of like the framework I'm working within right now.
And so in a let's just say it's for example, a high force session. We talked about the exercises earlier that are the main components of that high force, but where would even just maybe traditional movements, either a deadlift, a squat, a normal RDL, or anything like that, fit into like that day, if at all?
Yeah. So the way I kind of think of like fast force as it transitions through the year is as I introduce it in the off season, we're going to do those traditional movements. So we might hit whatever, rear foot elevated split squat, trap bar deadlift, bench press, like dumbbell bench. Like we'll hit those things in a traditional sense. But I just think that there's a overemphasis on like strong enough. And I think strong enough, especially for basketball players, occurs a lot sooner than people think. So we'll go traditional exercises for a period of time, especially if you're a younger guy, you might do it for 6 of the 8 weeks. But especially those older guys, I don't think they need to hit it for as long as much most people think. And then we'll transition from throughout the off season, we'll go from traditional exercises to drop catches to depth drops. And I want there to be some overlap. So there'll be traditional exercise solely, and then I'll start to introduce maybe a couple sets on the front end of the traditional trap bar deadlift, for example, with some drop catches. And then we'll go solely to drop catches. And then as I get to the end portion of that drop catch cycle, then I'll start introducing some of those compliant lands. So then when I'm able to go to solely drop depth drops, we've already introduced that concept a little bit, and it's more of like an easier transition. And then what I didn't mention is overcoming ISOs, and I'll use those throughout, but I really like to use the overcoming ISO as my like high force KPI because I think that while depth drops, what I've seen produce the highest peak force, and I'll use them in season, the highest of peak forces that it creates, I don't necessarily want to do those with my high minute guys throughout the entire in season. But I do feel perfectly comfortable doing an overcoming ISO throughout the entire year. So I'll really rely on like drop catches and depth drops in more of like a training sense and my overcoming ISOs, while you'll still get like a training stimulus from that exercise in more of a like KPI monitoring sense. So it's kind of layered together like that within the year. And then once I get to the in-season portion and we've just finished our highest peak force, most intense depth drops, and we get to that preseason where now we're going to 20 hours a week of training and practices are going to get way more intense. I'll take a step back from depth drops and I'll go back into more of like a traditional training sense. And I'll progress in the same way I did in the off season, where throughout the in season, I'll go from traditional exercises to drop catches till when we get to February and March. Now we're just hitting very, very low volume, but very high peak force depth drops.
Mhm. Is there a way we can kind of think about this and use essentially the system, the force system, when it comes to maybe a lower training age athlete, or even let's say high school athletes? Is there a way we could think about, gradually exposing them to these forces, and maybe obviously they don't need to start with a drop catch, but how we can kind of get them there and how we want to maybe apply this to that situation?
With those athletes, I don't even necessarily think of like the high force component or the fast force component really, even though I think that all athletes, regardless of age, should be sprinting.
Hmm.
I think of more of like I want to expose them to some of the human specifically and slow force components because I think that younger athletes are going to benefit greatly from the most general of training programs that are fun. And I think that human force constructed in the right way can be just like fun general physical development. And I think that if you have crawls and some parkour stuff and hanging from different implements, and if you have monkey bars and just like different ways to train them without feeling like there are goblet squat, inverted row, barbell RDL, and overhead press, I think that that goes a lot further in like general development that then they can progress into other components and be better off for it. And I think it's why every, I don't know, 4 to 7 year old is in gymnastics throughout the
Yeah.
entire country because like just those general tools that things like that give you set you up so well later in life when you want to get more specific.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't agree more. And also, so we talked a little before this, and we've talked a lot about the basketball setting because that's your main setting, but you also work with other sports, and triathlon is one of them. Is there a way you're implementing this maybe with a well, obviously triathlon has many components, but maybe a non-field or court sport athlete?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that my situation with triathlon is that they are their training within their actual sport is so intense and is so closely related to what I do that I try to it's really really about minimal effective dose with them. So I think that what I begin to think about is kind of like that high force component to help them on the bike and the fast force component to help them in running because if they can rely on their connective tissue just a little bit more in every step they take in a run, they're probably going to be better off. They're going to complete that run more efficiently. They're going to save more energy for other parts of their competition. And then really like because their training is so intense and they're running so many miles every week and biking so many miles every week and swimming, even though that's potentially less taxing on tendons and joints and things, there is a slow force component to try to like hold them together because they practice a lot.
I was just gonna ask.
They race a lot, and I think that that is going to be imperative for them because again, their training is extremely intense, and a lot of what they do is so closely related to what I do that I try to contribute a little bit to physical qualities and just hold them together so they can race as much as possible.
Yeah, exactly. All right, man. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. This has been awesome, and super insightful. Is there anything you wanna end with, or let people know where they can find out more about you or about the Force system?
The only thing I'll end with is just the disclaimer, and I like to put this because I'm not again, I'm not trying to like reinvent the wheel and go away from traditional things that are proven over time. I just think that there's been such an emphasis on powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, and like bodybuilding methods. And I truly don't believe that those solely are the best ways of producing better athletes. And I think if you look at a lot of traditional programs, it's like Olympic movement, powerlifting movement, hypertrophy accessories. And while that's how I've programmed, and there's still elements within my current program of that, I just think that there's a way you can transition to better suit athletes and what they do, and include components within those. Because as I talked about today, there's components of all
Yeah.
those, but it's not the what I'm hanging my hat on. In terms of where you can find me, I'm most active on Instagram, which is at Hunter Eis underscore SP. I try to post on there frequently about this stuff, and then a little bit on Twitter, but not as much. And then, as you mentioned, me and Mike Sullivan, my business partner, started Move the Needle Human Performance, and we have our own podcast. It's called Move the Needle, the Human Performance Podcast. You can check that out on anywhere you listen to the podcast. And we also have an Instagram page that we put some educational content out on at Move the Needle or MTN underscore perform. And then, as you mentioned, there's a 4 system program that I released on Train Heroic, which if you go through my IG bio, you can find that, and then just some articles I've written on Simply Faster. So there's ways to learn more about it for sure, and then I'm also always open for people to reach out and chat for sure.
Perfect. All right. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thank you.